everybody. We got a great one today, for a change. And this time, I mean it. First of all, I have two great guests. You should all know Frank Foer by now. He's been on the pod, or on the cast, as we say here. He's been on the podcast many times. I've actually lost count, and we don't keep records, do we, Peter?
No, but I would have if you had told me.
Okay, let's keep records.
Well, it's a little late now. I'd say Frank has been on somewhere between 8 to 12 times.
Well, that gives folks the idea anyway. And also today we have David Rothkopf, who writes often about foreign affairs for the Daily Beast.
And it's his first time on the Al Franken podcast.
Maybe we should keep a record of that.
I don't know. I think the horse is sort of out of the barn on record keeping. But I can keep track of David in my head.
Well, okay. The point is that both our guests are great on foreign affairs and on politics. And that's what we cover in our conversation today.
And it's a great one.
Okay. Thanks, Peter.
That's my job, sir.
Okay. Anyway, we've got a great one. Frank Foer and David Rothkopf.
And it's his first time on the Al Franken podcast.
Yes, Frank and David speak to all the frustrating barriers to ending the fighting in Gaza, the role of other countries in the region,
and the political divisions within Israel. That, of course, is a mess as well.
Okay, Peter, I'll take it from here.
You got it, boss.
We'll talk about the verdict in the Trump trial, the sentencing that Judge Merchan will be giving on July 11th. Is that right, Peter?
Right on the mark as usual, sir.
Thanks, Peter. I say he gets 30 days, maybe home confinement.
And I think that's spot on. 30 days at home with an ankle bracelet.
Okay, why don't we just go right to our conversation with Frank Foer and David Rothkopf. It's a great one.
For a change.
We're joined by Frank Foer. He is a staff writer for the Atlantic Monthly and in the pantheon of most frequent guests, joining the Al Franken podcast, along with Dahlia Lithwick and Norm Ornstein.
I wonder, why do I need an asterisk next to that, Al? Couldn't I have stood alone as one of the most frequent guests?
I think it's a great pantheon to be in.
No, I'm honored.
Yeah, you should be.
I'm honored.
Okay. But they're great too. And I'm really excited about having, and not that I'm not excited about you again, Frank, but David Rothkopf is on for the first time. He's a foreign policy, national security, and political affairs analyst and a columnist for the Daily Beast. Thank you for joining us, David.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's good to be here with Frank, who shares billing with Dahlia and Norm. We produce a podcast with Norm, so I appreciated the
You do?
Yeah.
Good. Well, Norm is amazing. There was a point where I really was depending on him too much. That's easy to do with Norm. So I thought we'd start with Israel and Gaza, Biden's offer, Netanyahu's reaction, and what the chances are of a ceasefire. And I'm not that optimistic, but there are some indications that maybe there's reason to have some hope here.
Well, I don't know if there's enough information to be optimistic or not. This is kind of a sketch of a peace plan. Kind of bears as much resemblance to a blueprint for peace as maybe a child's crayon drawing of a house does to a blueprint for a house. We sort of know that there's a phase 1, a phase 2, and a phase 3, and that there may be some hostages released at each point, and that there will be a 6-week ceasefire at phase 1, and then it could be extended or not, depending on, well, we don't know depending on what. We don't know what gets you from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. It all depends not only on getting Hamas to agree, which Biden says was his objective in making those remarks, but his real objective was getting the Israelis to agree.
But he says this is an Israeli plan.
Yeah, well, yeah. And some Israelis say it's an Israeli plan, but it's like the joke, how do you get 3 opinions? You put 2 Jews in a room. This is a little bit like the way the Israeli government works. They say it's their plan, and then hours later, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir say, if this goes forward, we quit the government.
Well, that's a good starting point to talk about how this could work, because they've threatened to quit the government if he takes this. And there's conjecture that if they quit the government, other parties will step in.
You have Yair Lapid's party.
Okay.
You have other parties that could possibly fill the void. The interesting thing, just stepping back a little bit, is looking at the one time that there was a ceasefire in this war, which was last November. And that was a moment when you had a convergence of interests. Hamas had hostages that it didn't actually want to deal with because they were babies, or Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, who's sitting in a tunnel right now and has been in a tunnel for months, is still a connoisseur of Western opinion. And he understood that it didn't look good to have so many kids in the tunnels. And Israel had completed the battle for northern Gaza, and it had a moment where it could take a breath. And so there was a brief convergence of interests. And ever since then, Bill Burns, the CIA director, the Qataris, the Egyptians, they've been trying to find some sort of harmonic convergence of interest where both sides would settle in. But the problem is that both Sinwar and Netanyahu, from their own perspectives, from very, very different strategic lenses, if you could call them strategic, have both thought that the war was going in their best political interests. Sinwar understood that he was winning and that Israel was being delegitimized on the public stage, and that he didn't need to do much but to let Israel continue fighting because they were going to just continue suffering.
And isn't that true? I mean, that is true. And to what extent is that true? To what extent does that undercut Israel's ability to go further in this war? I mean, do they have a world opinion interest in making this deal?
I mean, Israel, I think, has been relatively indifferent to global public opinion, to say the least.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure that that's foremost on Netanyahu's mind. I mean, I think perversely, public opinion in Israel seems to suggest that the public believes that they're winning this war and that Netanyahu's popularity is at a post-October 7th peak. So he doesn't have a huge political incentive to settle the war.
What does that mean? I mean, post-October 7th peak?
In polling, he does better than Benny Gantz. He beats his opponents, and Israelis seem to, at least in the polling that I've seen recently, seem to feel like the war is going their way.
There's another problem in all of this, and that is that if you get into a discussion of the day after and rebuilding Gaza, everybody thinks that the local Arab neighbors are going to rebuild Gaza. But they've already said that, there's several conditions for them doing that. One of which is getting rid of Hamas and getting real leadership for the Palestinians. And another is getting rid of Netanyahu and getting better leadership for the Israelis. So they're saying, yeah, sure, we'll help you solve this, but you guys have got to go. None of those guys want to go. And so, I think it's far more likely that you get a ceasefire, that it doesn't work out, that you get more fighting, that there is no rebuilding in Gaza, and that the 2.2 million people in Gaza continue to suffer for many, many months to come.
Yep.
Do you want me to paint an alternative?
Can you do it honestly?
Yeah, not really.
Okay.
But I think that what David's describing is highly plausible. But I think that if you look at what the Biden administration seems to be trying to set up right now, is that you have the ceasefire, which is that if they can get this in the interim, it becomes the basis for all of their further diplomatic plans, which is the Saudi normalization deal with Israel.
That's something that Israel would be very happy to have, is a normalization with.
It would be the capstone to Netanyahu's, in his mind, even before this war. Saudi normalization was the capstone to his career because he viewed his legacy as having Israel make its peace with the Gulf states at this moment when Israel's become a pariah in the Western world.
And there's a reason for this, which is Iran. I mean, there's a reason for.
Well, there's two reasons for it. One of them is Iran. That's the ostensible reason. There's another reason, which is he thought when he entered into the Abraham Accords that he could cut all these deals and the message to the world would be, hey, look, I'm getting along with everybody else. And oh, by the way, the Palestinians don't matter to them anymore. And so he thought he could kind of skate on the Palestinians by changing the subject. Of course, what's happened in the context of this war is that it's very difficult for the Saudis or anybody else to say, oh, sure, let's normalize while a couple of million people are starving to death.
Well, which is why you need a ceasefire and you need food going in. And there's reasons to do this.
They're very good reasons, and there are other problems too. If we're going to can we compound the list of problems?
Sure.
First of all,
we do.
That's what we do. So Netanyahu talks about total victory. There is no such thing as total victory over Hamas, even though I think you could make a case that militarily they've done a fairly effective job at destroying Hamas and its infrastructure. There will still be thousands upon thousands of Hamas militants who are armed, who will make security in whatever emerges on the other side of this war.
I can't imagine that this war hasn't created Hamas militants as well.
Well, and there's that too.
Right. And that was our experience in the war in Iraq. And in fact, there was a formula that one of our commanding generals came up with, which was for every one innocent person killed, you get 10 militants. Well, we can debate the number of innocent people killed here, but it's tens of thousands. And so the likelihood that all of this has made Israel safer is near zero.
Tom Friedman had said, don't go in, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, he doesn't trust Netanyahu, and his thought was focus on defending Israel. What happened on October 7th was the Israeli military was focused in another direction. They left their southern flank exposed, and the result was the horrors that we saw on October 7th. But, they could harden their borders. There are a lot of things they could do that didn't have them go into one of the world's most highly populated places and drop 2,000-pound bombs all around, thus creating a humanitarian catastrophe, horror upon horror, undermining Israel's security, undermining Israel's standing, undermining the U.S.'s standing for standing by Israel. There's almost no point from the period prior to October 7th through today where the decisions of the Israeli government haven't been completely wrong.
Yes, but it's, any nation responding to an event like October 7th would probably have responded in a military sort of way. I think one of the failures of the Biden administration in the aftermath of October 7th was instead of taking a kind of this arm around the shoulder, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to guide you to better answers, which just weren't possible in the days and weeks after October 7th, because Israeli leadership felt they understood their own failures in failing to defend and preempt October 7th. And that led to this atmosphere where they were almost bound to overreact and overinterpret bad evidence and to respond emotionally. What was the alternative? It wasn't staying out of Gaza. That was probably never going to happen. But there was a way to conduct operations within Gaza that actually that focused more precisely on eliminating Hamas command and control, eliminating the tunnel. They should have started in Rafah as opposed to Gaza, because the tunnels that allowed Hamas to continually rearm were in Rafah, not in northern Gaza.
Well, you're on the Pantheon, the Franken podcast Pantheon, but you're not a military strategist.
Whoa!
Well, I got to tell you, most of the military strategists I know agree with Frank, and they believe that the right.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Okay. All right. Well done. Touche.
But that's because the United States learned from experience in Iraq. Narrowly focused, more precision, special operations, targeting Hamas, trying to avoid targeting civilians would likely have been more effective, particularly if you combine that with hardening the borders, perhaps having a legitimate inquiry into how you got to October 7th in the first place, placing pressure on the Qataris and others who were providing funding to Hamas. There was a way to go about this that didn't produce 40,000 dead Palestinians. They didn't choose that way. It's been a disaster for everybody involved,
including for Biden. So where does this take him? You're the author of The Last Politician. You know Biden. Where does that put him in this campaign?
I think it's pretty easy to overstate the implications of this for the campaign per se. I mean, you look at the polling, it doesn't suggest that there are too many people who are voting on Gaza first and foremost, but I think it compounds larger problems that he has, and that for all the successes of the administration, and I think that they're many in legion, there is this public perception that there's a world that's spinning out of control, whether it's the border or manufactured issues like crime or inflation. And then you have this guy who is old, and there's a sense that somehow he's not able to keep things under control, which creates this yearning for a strong man.
A strong man like Trump.
Yeah.
He was very strong at the Trump Tower the other day. That speech or press conference.
Yeah, he was kind of deranged there. But I think what happened, it's kind of akin to the discussion that everybody's having about what's the effect of Trump's conviction. People remember 2016. And in 2016, 3 states were decisive: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The smart money is that they will be decisive again. Mm-hmm. The victory of Biden in those states was, 40,000, 70,000, something like that. And I think the big concern is, what happens if it rains, in Dearborn? What happens if it rains in Pennsylvania? And a bunch of people say, fuck this, I'm not going to vote today. And they stay on the couch. And that gives you the same effect of Jill Stein, or it multiplies the effect of RFK Jr. or whatever. And so people who say, well, this doesn't move the needle a lot, are ignoring the fact that all you have to do is move the needle a little for it to be consequential.
Well, it seems like the moving a little is you have a very large Muslim population in Michigan.
Yeah.
And you also have college students who, the irony here, of course, is that Trump is backed by the most militant pro-Israel people, and have the opposite view of those students and Muslims who are protesting Israel.
Well, I think that's true. But I think, the reality is that Jewish opinion has shifted a lot in the United States. J Street, which is a more progressive thinking Jewish organization, although still centrist, represents more closely the views of the majority of Jews in the U.S. than does AIPAC, which is kind of drifted right into the Likudnik Netanyahu kind of view of the world.
And is willing to spend money in campaigns to favor their candidates.
Yeah, but I just think the politics of this are not just important in the context of this election. I think they're important in the context of a kind of sea change in Jewish politics, a generational change that's taking place right now. I have 2 Jewish daughters who are married to Jewish guys who live in the most Jewish place in the world, in Brooklyn. They're going to Palestinian protests. They're strongly opposed to the Israeli government.
But they're going to vote for Biden.
Yeah, I think they are, because I think there is a change that's taken place. I'm just saying that there is a shift.
That you can protest the war, you can protest Israel, and you can still be for Biden, even though Biden has kept delivering the 2,000-pound bombs.
Well, I think you'd be for Biden because Trump is a lunatic.
Well, there's that.
I think if Biden were running against somebody semi-neutral, he would be in real trouble with them right now.
Well, let me ask you then, let's turn this to the result of the trial, which was a conviction on 34 counts. Make any difference in this campaign? I think it has to make some difference, even if it's just at the margins. And you were talking about the votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
I will plead guilty to being susceptible to all the ways in which Trump breaks analytical brains. And when I was coming out of the trial, what the story that I kept telling myself was, okay, he's going to get convicted. It's not going to matter because nothing Trump does ever seems to matter. And I think at least initially, I've been surprised to the extent to which it does seem to matter. Again, not necessarily mattering in the global sense, but in the sense that this is a very close election. And I think we in places like the Upper West Side and Upper Northwest Washington tend to assume that the rest of the world pays attention in the same sort of way we do. And I was just stunned by the number of people who said that they suspected that Trump was going to get off on this trial, that he'd done nothing guilty.
It made a lot of sense that people weren't paying a lot of attention, because to pay attention, you kind of had to pay a lot of attention.
But it's also just reflective of the way in which this election has felt to me like everything that's gone wrong with media over the course of the last 2 decades, in the ways in which media has become so much less important, the way that people get their information through these broken social networks, was coming home to roost. And so the fact that people didn't know what was going on is not just a product of the fact that their lives are busy, but also the fact that they get terrible information.
Yeah, but let's be honest here. He was convicted of 34 felony counts. That's bad. The reason he was trying to cover this thing up and to stop it was because it's bad. The reason he tries to cover up all of his other crimes is it's bad. When he says, "Oh, this is going to help me get elected," which is cuckoo, it's because he doesn't have any other choice. He has to try to make it look like it's good. But being a multiply convicted felon is a bad thing for a presidential candidate.
Well, we don't know that from experience.
No, we don't. You're absolutely right. But but we got to trust our instincts. But, to your point, all the people, all the kind of thoughtful pundits who are stroking their chins on this and saying, "Oh, well, this could help Trump," or this could. Nobody knows. We've never seen this before.
Yeah, because the polling I've seen would be like 25% of people who are leaning for Trump said it makes them more likely to vote for Trump. Now, those people were going to vote for Trump. And then 10% of the people who said they were leaning to vote for Trump said this makes them less likely to vote for Trump. Now, they're probably the 10% of people who were thinking of not voting for Trump anyway. You can't read this. This is impossible to tell, I think, right now anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right, because most of our politics is tribal. This will have an effect at the margins. It's probably not a good effect on Trump. Frankly, as much of the verdict being a bad effect, that press event, whatever you want to call it, that took place on Friday, those kind of things are worse because he was on cloud cuckoo land. He couldn't put a sentence together. He was talking about sheetrock. He was talking about Judge Merchan looked like an angel, but he was actually a devil. It was insane.
Right. Because one of the perverse effects of having Trump sit in a courtroom day after day, it actually acts as a rhetorical straitjacket on him.
He's got to be loony.
He's limited. Yeah, he's limited in access to cameras. And that one of the things that has just been strange about this campaign is the way in which it really hasn't actually started yet, even though we're in June and we know who the nominees are. And it's been stuck as a referendum on Joe Biden, which is not the race that Joe Biden wants to run. And so
compare me to
having Trump, having guilty headlines and then handing the microphone to Trump so that he can launch into his eloquent soliloquies is probably a useful thing.
So let me ask you this. If you guys were in charge of sentencing Trump, he appears before a probation board before who gives their recommendation. He does that first before the sentencing, and they give their recommendations to Merchan. And I was thinking it'd be really funny if the probation board gives this report to Merchan. He was very contrite, very sorry that he had taken care of the problem in a manner that turned out to be illegal, but he didn't know that at the time, he said. He was very humble and choked up a bit when he said what the effect of the trial was on his wife. But mainly he thanked us for the job that we do, which he said he imagines is very difficult.
Yeah, sounds about right. Sounds about right.
Merchan would be going like, what? That's what happened. Because I can't, how he's going to give the worst. They're going to have the worst meeting they've ever had with a guy, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think he's going to have to appear on July 10th in front of the judge. And the judge is going to say, how do you feel about all this? And he's going to say, this is corrupt and you're a crook and Biden did all this to me and I'm going to appeal it. And, and if I'm elected president, I'm going to throw you in a concentration camp. Then Mershon is going to be in a kind of a rough spot. And because after all, Michael Cohen went to jail for multiple years for this, right? Or was sentenced to multiple years. But, is he actually going to send him to prison?
What if he gave him 30 days at a place where he can work on his golf game?
I mean, that's a good idea. I've thought that one of the punishments he could do is he could sentence him to 6 months of not using the first person singular.
Well, is Trump a first person singular? Because that's he never refers to himself as I, because he just goes, Trump does this, Trump says this. Trump, I don't think he'd skirt that.
It's not to be a grammar marm, but it's also a reference to an organization. And so you're right. First person singular, there's technicalities, so loopholes there.
I found that loophole right away.
I withdraw the sentence and I resign from the bench.
I actually think that something like 30 days at just a minimum security place where he's got Secret Service with him for life, right? So they are every day. And so he wouldn't have to deal with lust nuestra familia.
He wouldn't have to carve. He wouldn't have to carve his own shivs because he'd have somebody to do that for him.
Yeah, you take the bar of soap on a rope, shower. That's a good weapon. He'll pick up some stuff.
His palate's so great. I don't think he'd mind the prison food. And the jumpsuit would match the hair.
Yeah, orange is the new orange. But I do think he will get some amount of. I mean, whether he gets 30 days or 60 days or 90 days of incarceration or house arrest, he'll get a year or two of probation, and that's going to make his life real difficult. The other thing, by the way, that nobody talks about here, because they'll say, well, he probably won't get a big sentence on this, is that if he's convicted of any other felony, the fact that he was convicted of this felony is an aggravating circumstance and suggests it's more likely he'll get a jail term in the subsequent conviction.
Well, this all is about him. He has to lose, though.
Or Georgia, but yes.
Or Georgia. And if he wins, and does he serve during his presidency in either Georgia or New York? I don't think so. Does he? I can't see that.
Probably not. We're going to all, it's very interesting because we're all in the next couple of weeks, our friends at the United States Supreme Court are going to hand down their view on whether presidents get immunity and under what conditions presidents get immunity. And of course, since they don't use the law or precedent to determine their rulings anymore, anything could happen.
Yeah. I just think they'll carve out something that isn't so outrageous that everyone goes like, well, they're totally fucking illegitimate now. But I guess overturning Roe was they had the numbers, and they've been kind of signaling they wanted to do that for a long time.
Well, having your wife run a coup is also probably a problem. The kind of thing you would think they would avoid in these circumstances.
I think run a coup I think it was more participate in it.
Well, she helped raise the funds for the buses. Okay, she was she played a role.
She got the bear spray for a couple of people.
Exactly. But I think what's most likely is that they're going to say presidents have limited immunity to official acts. Now, Judge Chutkan, figure out what were the official acts, and we'll spend the next 10 months arguing out whether running a fake elector scheme is an official act or not.
Well, then does it go to the circuit court?
It goes back down to Judge Chutkin to figure that out.
Well, it goes to Chutkin first, but after she makes a decision, does it go
then
to
it'll
the
go
circuit
back
court?
up. It'll go back to DC Court of Appeals, and then the Supreme Court.
So that takes forever. Let's talk about the deep state. You've written an article, Frank, on that. That's your most recent article in the Atlantic, and you're saying the deep state is K Street.
Exactly. Well, I think that when you look at what Trump is about to unleash on the world, if he is to return to office, I mean, Trump is a guy who's built himself as this populist who wanted to drain the swamp. But during his first term, the swamp expanded quite rapidly. Lobbying boomed. And I think headed into a second term, what you see is that we've talked about this a little bit before, and it probably doesn't get talked about enough, which is that his ultimate goal is to destroy the capacity of the administrative state, which his cronies or the ideologists at the Heritage Foundation and in all of these pro-business libertarian factions of the Republican Party have long dreamed of, and that Trump, because of his personal vindictiveness and his impetuousness, is able to enact this retribution scheme against the bureaucrats, which is not just about purging the enemies from the ranks. It's about replacing them with hacks and loyalists who will do the bidding of business, of industry, that what is about to be unleashed on the world is systematic corruption of the kind that you see in places like Hungary.
Speaking of which, David, you talked about Orban and a lot of the kind of right wing, and I include Putin in that, people responding to this conviction in a way that they just sounded like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Well, they didn't sound kind of like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They sounded exactly like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They were using words like weaponization. One of the right-wing leaders said, "Oh yeah, this is going to help Trump win again." They were singing from exactly the same hymnal. And there's a point where it's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy. And you've got, in this particular case, the global right-wing movement, which starts at the Kremlin and includes Putin and Orban and leaders in Serbia and Slovakia and Trump and I think Netanyahu and Modi and some others, Erdogan, they all have similar goals. They want to weaken the constraints of the state against them. They use the other and immigration as targets. They all say they're anti-woke, by the way, in their various languages. They all say that they don't like fake news. It's one party, and Putin is in it, and Orban is in it, and Trump is in it, and Josh Hawley is in it. I think it's important to see that way because it's got much bigger consequences. I've got a piece coming out at Frank's old stomping ground at the New Republic. I just got back from Eastern and Central Europe. And I talk to people in Eastern and Central Europe, and they hold their heads in their heads. And they say, you can't possibly elect Trump. And the reason that they feel this way is if Trump gets elected and hands over Ukraine, Putin gets a green light, Putin starts moving further against Georgia, further against Moldova, further against the Baltics. You start seeing Eastern Europe looking more and more like it did during the Cold War. And they remember what that was like. So for them, this is really real. We've never lived through authoritarianism. So for us, it's kind of abstract. But they're like, this is existential. So it's not just that they're, reading the same notes following the conviction. It's that there is this concerted effort where all of them are working together towards a common goal. And that goal includes weakening our institutions, weakening the United States, weakening NATO, and making the world safe for oligarchy.
And kleptocracy. And you, Frank, wrote in the end of the year issue in the Atlantic Monthly, you wrote a piece about Trump sort of mirroring Orban. And boy, oh boy, if he gets rid of, quote, the deep state and replaces them with his cronies and has them work with the lobbyists who are part of now the deep state, this could get really, really corrupt and ugly and counterproductive for our country.
Right, because the first Trump term was in a way a dry run, that there was a lot that Trump didn't understand about how the American system would respond to him. And so there were moments during his first term where he hedged or he turned back. And what he came to discover after a couple of years was that there were essentially no limits. And one of the limits that he was trying to test were the limits of his own party. He thought that there was some potential that he would suffer backlash for cronyism or for kleptocracy. And he realized that he could get away with whatever he wanted within the Republican Party. And that business was trying to figure out, and lobbyists and trade associations were trying to figure out how to exploit the Trump administration. And so they played various games, they adopted various strategies, but headed into a second term, everybody has experience, everybody has learned, everybody knows what the rules are like, and everybody knows that they can get away with a lot more than they ever dreamed was possible. And then you include the fact that the courts have shifted even further
and
in that
they
direction.
will shift. Again, in the next 3 weeks, this Supreme Court is going to overturn what's called the Chevron doctrine, which allows the administrative state to regulate corporations.
I love the Chevron doctrine because the Chevron doctrine said that you had to listen to the deep state. You had to listen to those in the agencies that were actually making. For example, we passed the Affordable Care Act, right? And we passed that in 2010, and it took 4 years really for it to be in full force. That was because the regulations had to be written. It took that long to really write the regulations, get them up. This is complicated, and that was a long written bill. But you had to implement it. And the people who were implementing it were people who had expertise in how delivering medical care works. We couldn't have written that bill with all the regulations. It's impossible. And so we need agencies to do those kinds of things.
But the Chevron doctrine is going to have an effect by removing Chevron deference. What the effect is going to be is a giant windfall for corporations. It is like the Trump tax cut. It is going to pass billions and billions of dollars down to people. And, sometimes you may ask yourself, why do all these rich people support Trump? Do they really want to take away the right to get birth control? No, they don't give a shit about that. They want more money. They want tax cuts and they want regulatory cuts. Another case that we've seen in the past couple of weeks is Trump having a meeting with oil industry executives and saying, hey guys, give me $1 billion and I won't regulate the oil industry anymore.
So two points in this. One is, we've talked about Europe, and when you visit Europe, you get the sense that there is this awakeness to the dangers of a second Trump term that's not present in the United States. We're sleepwalking into this election. There's this assumption that because things worked out relatively okay last time and that the system didn't totally collapse and we were able to rebound, that will be the case this time. But the second part is that it's very galling to hear, we talked about the focus on Gaza, where suffering is real, and it's understandable that people would feel some anger at the administration. But the way in which so many Americans have lost complete perspective on the distinction between the two candidates. And the reason that the rich people are pissed is because Joe Biden actually has accomplished important things in terms of shifting the trajectory of the economy. We're talking about the Chevron doctrine. We're talking about the regulatory state. When you listen to billionaires wail against the dangers of Joe Biden, which seems so far away from the way that everybody else in the world describes Joe Biden. They actually view him as a malevolent force because they can point to Lena Khan and to Jonathan Cantor in the way in which this administration has been so damn active on antitrust, and that they've done important but very subtle things as it relates to reinforcing the regulatory state, and the way in which they've embraced industrial policy and unions and the like. The economic shift that this administration has presided over is real, and plutocracy hates it, which is why the likes of Silicon Valley, the likes of finance are shifting to Donald Trump in such a meaningful, hard way.
It's so right, and it's such a big deal. Joe Biden is old and gray and a little bit boring, and nobody expected it. But what Joe Biden has done in terms of economic policy, now a lot of credit goes to Janet Yellen and some other people that nobody talk about. is he has actually, for the moment anyway, stuck a stake through the heart of neoliberalism, of a consensus that dominated Republican and Democratic thinking for the past 40 years. And like when I was in the Clinton administration, if I had said, hey, let's have an industrial policy, I would have been defenestrated. You just couldn't talk about that kind of thing.
Your windows would have been taken out of you?
Well, that's a rough translation. But I would have been tossed out a window. And the reality is this has been kind of revolutionary, including a minimum tax on corporations globally that happened in the first year of the administration that nobody pays attention to, including all the things that Frank just listed. It's remarkable. And it's had, people like Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary, howling because when we hit an economic crisis, Biden radically said, you know what? I'm going to help people and not banks. I'm going to help people keep their jobs and not Wall Street keep their bonuses. And,
I'm going to help people who don't have jobs.
Right.
And need money.
Yeah. Right. And so he created lots of jobs and a lot of Dems and Republicans were like, oh my God, this is going to cause inflation. Biden said, I'll take a little inflation. I'm going to work for a different group of people now. I'm going to do something for the middle class. And it's radical. And he deserves big credit for that.
But if you look at the views of middle class people, inflation is still one of their number one complaints. And that's because, when it went up like 9% in July of 2022, that was scary, but the prices don't go down again. I mean, in other words, so if they go up 3% the next month and 3% the next month and 3% the next month, it still has gone up that 9% for a month, which is 9/12%.
It's a hard. There are complexities, and it's a hard message to sell because the tolls of inflation are real, and the tolls of fighting inflation are real, and so you have high interest rates.
People think we have high unemployment now. I mean, I've seen some recent polling. People are completely not economic literate.
No, they don't want inflation to disappear. They want deflation, which would be disastrous for
right. And a lot of the inflationary pressures you've talked about, as you just implied, are caused by corporations gouging on prices, gas, and other kinds of things.
Didn't corporations always gouge? This is one of the things I don't get.
Well, they take advantage of the opportunities, and some governments have pushed back on it harder than other governments.
But I think our inflation is lower than elsewhere in the world.
Lower than elsewhere. Our recovery from the pandemic is stronger than anywhere else in the developed world. Our GDP growth is stronger. Our job creation is stronger.
So you should resurrect Bidenomics again.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, there are all these people, they write these articles and they go, oh, Bidenomics isn't working. Okay, maybe the problem partially is the media doesn't actually cover this the way that it needs to be. I don't mean to blame the media, but it's not going
You're
through.
Right. You're right. They happen to be right. They only report bad news because good news isn't interesting.
Well, that's right. And
they're trying to get hits.
And it also seems fairer to poke holes in this recovery, which has been remarkable, and so that's where we're left here. But whenever somebody says, oh, a lot of Americans think that inflation is going up. Well, 86% of Americans or something believe in angels. Americans believe a lot of shit that's not true.
Well, you can't disprove angels, okay? So
well,
you can disprove that, inflation is not going up relative to what it was before. But if you say inflation is going up, that just means prices are going up to people. So if it goes up 3% instead of 9%, that's still inflation to them. So them I can cut a break on. It's the things like unemployment is at an all-time high. those kind of things that a lot of people say, like 50% of Americans say that. I just read an article about this, and it's
top of mind.
Well, no, it's important, isn't it? And when I said Bidenomics, they trotted that out, thinking what we're thinking, which is, holy mackerel, we didn't go into recession when we fought inflation.
Right. Well, they meant a lot of things, and I don't think that but I don't think that they've effectively messaged their accomplishments. Part of it is that Joe Biden is only intermittently capable of populism, that there's a rhetorical frame that's available to him to talk about price gouging, to talk about the enemies that he's amassed who are opposed to his economic agenda, and to sell that. And he's only done that here and there. He gave a speech last Labor Day that I thought was pretty effective, where he talked about Donald Trump as being a puppet of the oligarchs, just another Park Avenue type of guy. And I think that there's a lot there that he could be running on. But Biden himself, even if he's made a great deal of enemies in the course of enacting his economic agenda, doesn't especially enjoy adopting an adversarial politics.
Well, there's another problem, too. As a friend of mine who I was in the government with used to say, Democrats are really good for coming up with 1,000 reasons to do something, but never just one. And so they're out there going, we're going to get rid of junk fees on your airline ticket.
Okay, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
great. What's
but
the one reason?
I mean, pick one. Best job creation ever. Best recovery from COVID of any country in the world. How about that? Best recovery of any country. But try to come up with a way to communicate it simply, as opposed to saying, there are 26 bridges within 1,000 miles of your house. I'm all for the,
you're talking about the infrastructure.
Yeah, I think that's good. But you get down into the minutiae and you lose the big picture.
Can't they do an ad where they do an ad of the infrastructure projects, the impressive infrastructure projects that they're doing around the country, like a quick 30-second. Boom, 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 boom.
Or also just go and say, look, this is the biggest investment in infrastructure in the United States in 70 years or 65 years or whatever it is since the Eisenhower administration.
And show Eisenhower and show the interstate highway system and then say, this is what we're doing.
I moderated a panel with Ron Klain, who was chief of staff.
Yes.
Who was responsible for a lot of this. And he made the point, enough with the fucking bridges already. And his point was a good one, which is that those are all meaningful achievements that people can connect with on some level. But people aren't going to vote for Biden because there's a new bridge crossing the river. They're going to vote for him because he's done various things that really make their economic life palpably better in the way that they experience it from a household perspective. And he needs to tell a story about how that will continue into the next 4 years in a way that connects more viscerally than bridges.
Okay, and this is bringing down the price of insulin.
Yeah. Or something like junk fees, I think gets closer to the mark because that's something it's extremely annoying and hurts people.
According to a very senior official in the current administration a couple of weeks ago, the thing that polls the best is what you just said, Al. It's reducing drug prices. That of all the things that polls well for them, it's that.
When you go into the pharmacist, you just get nervous every time, and it's like, what's this going to be? Is this going to be $12, $50, $2? I have no friggin' clue. I haven't taken this medicine before. And then sometimes it's, $60 or something like that. And a lot of people, that's a bite. They should be hitting that. But I also like bridges. I'm sorry.
Your point is there are thousands of bridges. Make an ad, show that we're changing the country. The Chips and Science Act has produced more investment in science and technology in the past year than occurred in the preceding 20 years in the United States. That's a big deal. There are some big things you can point out while you're also pointing out that the other guy is a felon and a traitor and is going to strip away women's reproductive rights.
But the point is, it should be a good message. It's that he doesn't need to create a narrative from whole cloth. The material is there to work with, both in describing his own accomplishments and in describing his adversary. And this is game time now, and it's time to simplify that message and start selling the hell out of it. And I think the frustration has been that they're wringing their hands too much of the time.
Okay, we've covered everything.
Well, that's a relief.
I don't know. I think that people want more Chevron doctrine.
They're going to care about
the Chevron doctrine. Those who are listening to this still, the Chevron doctrine is an amazingly important thing. And what's it basically going to do is allow the Supreme Court justices to vote every time for not letting, the EPA regulate CO2. Right?
No, the Chevron doctrine is how Clarence Thomas is earning his RV. It's how they're paying back the guys that pump the money into supporting the Republican Party, supporting the Federalist Society, and all of that.
And it pays for Alito's flags.
Upside down flags, the whole thing.
That would be funny if those were gifts from people who had business before the court. I guess an upside down flag is just a flag. It's just an American flag. But
the appeal to heaven flag, that's something else.
Yeah, that he got from Clarence, who it was just I just have so much stuff, Sam. Here's yours. You guys, thank you.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.